I am really excited about this project about Vegemite, not only within its Australian context, but within its American context, which was short-lived. But is a fun story, even though we're going to be drawing from a lot of the historical record. And for me, this is a particularly fun project, not only because I went into the archive and found something completely unexpected, but because this is my history. I'm Australian American. I only have an accent when I drink enough of those cocktails that we were just talking about. But this is a story that I think you'll enjoy a lot. But for any of you who are not familiar with what Vegemite is, it's a yeast extract. It's what's left over from the beer brewing process, and it makes a salty, gelatinous, axle grease-looking spread that goes nicely in sandwiches, goes on toast, goes on crackers. Nutritionally, it's incredibly high in B vitamins, which has been a big part of how it's been promoted. B vitamins are involved in energy metabolism in the body, so they're this link to vitality. It's also a low-calorie food, a non-fat food, but a very high-sodium food. So if you were to describe it, it's essentially umami incarnate. So don't look at it and think it's going to taste like chocolate or Nutella. You will be very sorely led astray. It's rumored that 90 to 95% of Australians have Vegemite in their cupboards, and when they travel abroad, they simply don't leave home without it. And once I started researching this, I had to go on Amazon and find it and order some, because I've been eating lots of it as I've been working on this project. So a little bit of its history. Vegemite was developed in 1923. It was a purposeful copy of Marmite, which is a similar tasting spread from Britain. So if we have any English people, I bow to you. This was yours first. And what happened was Fred Walker, an Australian food businessman, hired Cyril Callister, an early food scientist in Australia, to develop a copy of Marmite. And in the process, they had a shared mutual interest with James Kraft of Kraft Foods in developing a shelf-stable processed cheese, which to us right now probably doesn't sound very delectable, but at that time we're in the early days of domestic refrigeration, food preservation was in a very different place, and so having these shelf-stable products were very important. So that's our first US connection to Vegemite. We have an American company owning rights of it from very early on after it's created. The second American twist is with its advertising company. J. Walter Thompson was one of the first gigantic ad firms in the United States, and they had played a role in Kraft's dominance in the American processed cheese market, and thus were the creators of much of Vegemite's advertising campaigns, which play a large role in its rise to an icon status. It was not a popular food at first, even to Australians who had eaten Marmite and enjoyed it, but it slowly begins its upward trend because of this marketing, but also because of World War II. It's rationed at the home front, so there are shortages domestically. It's sent in ration kits to the battlefront where soldiers get their vitality from it, and J. Walter Thompson will not let Australian consumers forget about it. There's repeated advertising in newspapers and in magazines that Vegemite is being given up at this particular moment, but it will be back. And so with that, it becomes linked to patriotism, becomes linked to the ideas of nationhood that come out of wartime. And in the post-war era is where we see Vegemite's meteoric rise to this icon status. It becomes a symbol of a new nationalism, independent from the British Empire, leaving behind the legacy of the Commonwealth as a more independent nation with its own identity. Although they still remain linked, we can definitely talk about that. But it's linked with health, the B vitamin connection, and particularly with children. Many people rumor Vegemite is the first solid food that Aussie babies have. And so it's connected to this idea of future prosperous, healthy generations of Australians. And so here is Vegemite, successful and a part of everyday Australian life. J. Walter Thompson and Kraft are in a pretty solid place in their Australian market, and for some reason, they decide we should try to market this in the United States. There are very few clues to the mystery of why they thought that would be a good idea. One that some of you might be aware of is the television show Skippy the Kangaroo. So in the vein of Flipper, these animals that can help solve problems and lead humans to solve small crimes, Skippy the kangaroo was a kangaroo who, I think he wants us to follow him, and he would help them solve these problems. So this was an incredibly popular Australian syndicated television show. It was shown on networks throughout the United States. So that is happening during this time when all of a sudden we have Vegemite being advertised in the United States. It was a short period from 1968 to 1970 in newspapers and in magazines, and there were three sort of separate campaign tactics. The first, we had these celebrity endorsers, Australian athletes who no American would have recognized. This is a life captain from the beach, Bondi Beach, which is incredibly famous. This is Betty Cuthbert, who was a four-time Olympic winner for sprinting. So we had this first campaign that was Vegemite is the secret to these athletes' athletic prowess. It's special from Australia. It's new. You can find it in your grocery store. There was another campaign with coupons, or you buy the Vegemite, we'll bring the crackers, or you could get reimbursed for a box of crackers. And then there was a third scare tactic campaign aimed at mothers. Are you sure that your children are getting their B vitamins? They should be eating Vegemite. So unlike in Australia, where it's linked to these cherubic, happy children, it's a very different tone in how we approach motherhood and Vegemite for children. So these campaigns were described as a substantial promotional effort. Money was certainly invested in them, but they never attracted much interest. It was concluded that Vegemite simply did not appeal to the American palate, and it was a complete failure of advertising trying to push this new product in a new culture. But there's nothing in the newspaper record at this time about Vegemite. There are hardly any hits. So I was like, gosh, what am I going to do? You keep looking, and in 1982, all of a sudden, everyone in America wants to talk about Vegemite because of this Australian pop culture wave that takes over the United States for this brief period in the 1980s. So for the first time, we have Australian-made films made in a Hollywood image that do exceptionally well. The Mad Max trilogy, which will be remade, we'll have a new one here soon, as well as stars like Mel Gibson, Brian Brown, Paul Hogan, with Crocodile Dundee, sort of later in 1986 in the decade. In the arena of sports, Australia, too, wins the America's Cup, winning over a century of American prowess in sailing. Greg Norman on the golf course. There was an Australian in the Major League Baseball League. And then in pop music, we have Australian successes like Olivia Newton-John, The Little River Band, AC/DC, Air Supply. And so within this context of all this Australian pop culture that Americans were very excited about, we had Men at Work's song, Down Under, who had the lyric in one of the verses, he just smiled and gave me a Vegemite sandwich. And all of a sudden, people all across America, whether it was in California or North Dakota or New York, they were calling into radio stations wanting to find out what Vegemite was and where they could get it. The Australian embassy got so many calls that they put a message on their message board where people would know where to go get it. So there's this great interest as a result of this far more complex marketing mix. It wasn't advertising alone. It was a cultural moment where a food product was this lens for American perception of Australia. My father's Australian and says it wasn't unusual traveling in the 70s for Americans to confuse you with Austrians. It was a time when all we knew were wombats and koala bears and kangaroos. So this was a moment where tourism of Americans going to Australia, of American-Australian businesses alliances, we can see all of this through the lens of Vegemite. This is a key time period where a lot of those changes take place. And so as I looked through all of this press coverage, there are sort of three categories of how Americans wrote about Vegemite. The first was with an interest in exoticism. It was considered cooler than caviar. It was the new sushi. It was what food writers said was an in food. It was not an out food. So people were very excited about it. This transitioned into enthusiasm for Australian fashion and other crafts, all through this lens of Vegemite. The second group was this foodist disdain, the idea of describing Australian cuisine as English food, but worse. And so in a nation with so little to offer, a slather of Vegemite on a slice of toast was the closest thing you could get for a national dish. So this sort of cultural elitism was about the food as well as about Australian culture as well. We see music writers talking about men at work like that. We didn't know Australia made pop music. You see a lot of this sort of sentiment. And then lastly, you have this bemused derision, right? This is a disgusting food that only Australians like. And that's okay, but we don't like it, and we're never going to eat it. And that's kind of where we still are. It's this desperately culturally specific food. In interviews, people say, you have to have been born here to like it. There were interviews with a Qantas steward who said, in 18 years of flying, I have never found a non-Australian who can get it down. And so Paul Rosen is a very famous food psychologist, and so he did a survey of 200 people and quantified this anecdotal assertion. You quite literally have to have been born there or exposed to it as a child to find Vegemite palatable. And so it remains a candidate for the world's most culturally specific food. So should you ever find yourself in an opportunity where you can taste it, this is how to do it safely and responsibly. So Vegemite for beginners, you have to have hot toast, a good smattering of butter, and then you spread it very thinly. This was actually the language in those ads in 1968. They had to tell people, don't think it's peanut butter, just very, very thinly. This is regular consumers and then Vegemite for those who want to die. I'm somewhere in between these two. I'm a huge fan and I think it's pretty darn great. So I didn't bring any with me. Some of you will sigh with relief that you will not be asked to try it. But it's certainly an interesting food product. And the role of culture, the role of advertising, the role of history in creating what it is in Australia as well as what it continues to be here is something that I'm continuing to unpack as I spend time with this project. So I thank you so much for being a part of this story.
Thank you, Emily.